So what are footsies? If you ask that question to 100 fighting game players, you would get 100 different answers. I've heard footsies is poking. I've heard footsies is whiff punishing. I've heard footsies is the act of controlling space. I've heard footsies is the neutral game. And none of those definitions will really help a player get better at the game, or get better at footsies. So what I want to do today is I want to sort of give up my own definition of footsies, while trying to make that definition as useful as possible. And so in order for it to be useful, it needs to be something that you can think about during a game. Or specifically, it needs to be what you think about during the game. And so the definition that I've come up with is footsies are the entire set of viable strategies that players can employ the most often in order to try to win. So there are several very interesting things in that sentence. Footsies is a set of viable strategies, and I'd say viable in that there's a reason to use it when you're trying to win. It's sort of easier to define a strategy that is not viable, or a strategy that is outclassed by a different strategy which accomplishes the same thing but better, or accomplishes the same things plus more things. Probably the most important variable in the match that determines which strategies are viable and which are not viable is the range. So for example, if I'm over here, I'm probably not going to command grab you, but if I'm here, you know, it's possible for me to get into command grab range within your reaction window, so suddenly the command grab is viable. But the thing is, there's a particular range where the number of options that you have tends to be about the same. And in fact, if you're further than that range, you have very few options. In fact, your best options are options that move you forward into range of your other options. But then as soon as I break that range, my options start to get bigger. So for example, if I'm at this range, I can hit this button and it'll hit, but I can't hit this button. So footsies is not something that exists or doesn't exist. It's not a game that you play, per se, but it is your interpretation of the game, and it comes and goes in chunks. As the range changes, as the player's amount of super meter changes, as their life bars change, as their guard bars change. There are several variables that go into footsies, and so the way that I've defined footsies is it is the most common set of options, which tends to be at this mid-range right here. Therefore, a command grab is not a viable strategy at this range, and is thus not in footsies. Now, I would differentiate footsies from the neutral game by saying that footsies are the actual strategies employed by the players, whereas the neutral game is the state of the game. So you play footsies, but the game is in neutral. Although people do say things like, oh, he is good neutral, whereas I think that should be he is good at playing in the neutral. Now keep in mind that neutral does not mean even. There are definitely characters that thrive in the neutral game, and they tend to be more defensive based, and by that I mean they try to maintain the neutral game state for as long as possible because they tend to win in neutral, whereas there are other characters that are more aggressive, and maybe they aren't as good in the neutral. They actually prefer being out of the neutral because they're very good at acquiring advantages. So in that case, the neutral is not even at all. The neutral is in favor of the character who is more defensive. And so in that sense, there are two possible goals when playing footsies. One is to win the game, which is the more obvious one, and the other is not necessarily to win the game, but to win footsies by leaving footsies in some way that benefits you. Probably the most evident example of this is to jump in and have them block your jump attack, which gives you frame advantage. Be sure to check out my guide on frame data, which I will link in the description below. And well, how do you win in most fighting games? Well, it's by dealing damage, right? So a defensive footsies playstyle would be throwing out pokes like this, right, trying to get the damage. Or maybe you have a poke that's long range and cancelable, so you know you throw it out, that didn't combo, but pretend it comboed. Whereas a more aggressive footsies would be like hopping in, I want to get frame advantage. I don't necessarily want to damage you, but I want to get out of footsies in some scenario in which my options are greater than yours, such as frame advantage. Or maybe that advantage is meter, like now I have more metered options. Now I said that I wanted to try to be as useful as possible, and so far this has been pretty theoretical and not useful, so let's try to move on to something that is more useful, which is something that I like to call baby footsies. And so, what are baby footsies? Well, the thing to know about footsies is that it's going to change from game to game. I've been talking about hops this entire time, right? Hops don't exist in every fighting game. EX moves don't exist in every fighting game. Clark's standing heavy kick doesn't exist in every fighting game, so footsies is going to be different depending on the game you're playing, and the characters, and even sometimes the stages. There are many factors that can change how footsies is played. So instead of talking about them generally, let's talk about them in a specific game, and I'm calling that game Baby Footsies. Now, this game doesn't exist. The game I'm talking about is the barest fighting game possible, the most basic. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what constitutes a fighting game? Well, I'll define a fighting game as any 1v1 game where two human opponents have direct control over a character on the screen, and the game ends when one player uses their character to defeat the other player's character. Now that's also a very vague definition, but we can imply some things. One is that, we have control over a character, so the most basic form of control over your character is being able to walk left and right. And so now the goal is to hit the opponent, right? But we need an attack to do that. So we have walking, and we have attacking, and that's it. So the goal of the game is to hit the opponent with an attack, and when you hit them with the attack, you win. That is the most basic fighting game possible. Now note here that it is very important that forward walking toward the opponent, is faster than walking backwards. Otherwise it'd be a really boring strategy because you just walk away the entire time. So forward walking is faster than backward walking, which leads us to our first strategy, which is aggressive poking, i.e. walking into the range of your attack and then hitting it. So at round start, I'm at here, but if I walk forward into the range of my attack and hit it, that is the aggressive poke. So how do you develop a strategy? Well, you take the most basic thing and you beat it. So I'm going to set the dummy to do an aggressive poke. So when I press play, he walks up and does the poke. So now what can I do to beat that poke? Well, there is actually two answers to that. And if you've watched Juicebox's video on Footsies, you know those two ways. But before I go over those two ways, there's other things that I need to point out here about this particular attack. One of the first things you learn in fighting games is that attacks have startup, active, and recovery. Although technically they don't have active frames, it's just they have a startup and then recovery, and then what defines those two parts is what happens in the middle, which is the attack hitbox spawning. And that hitbox can last for a number of frames, but it's best to think of the move as having a startup and a recovery, and the attack hits in between those. It's also important to note that you cannot move during the attack, so if I walk, I'm stationary during the attack. So it's important to have these, because otherwise it would be a really degenerate strategy of just moving forward and pressing the attack button as fast as possible. So by adding startup and recovery and making you stationary, there's a pretty big window where you can punish them, so there's a counter strategy there. So let's take advantage of the startup by attacking first. So this is a pretty logical thing to come up with. If both players are in range of the attack and they both do the same attack, well, who wins? It's the one who attacks first. Which leads us to predictive poking, or defensive poking, which means that I attack him while he's walking toward me, before he's in range of my attack. Like that. I press the button before he's in range of the attack, but he continues to walk into it. This is why I call it a predictive poke, is because, well, I'm doing it in anticipation of him walking into it. And this works as a strategy because the attack has startup. If the attack didn't have any startup, then there'd be no reason to do it predictively. I would just wait until he's in range and then hit it. Now, of course, there is startup in that we have human reaction time, but by adding actual startup to the move, now it's something tangible that we can build a strategy around. And so that's what predictive poking is we are waiting for them to walk forward and hitting them as they walk forward. Now, what's the other way to beat pokes? Well, it is whiff punishment, and so whiff means the attack whiffs or misses. So how do you make them miss? Well, if they're walking to a particular range and hitting the button, all we have to do is walk backwards out of that range, causing their attack to whiff. Like that. So again, at round start, if I do nothing, he's in range, whereas if I take one step backwards, it misses. And so because it misses, and because he's stationary during it, and because he has a recovery animation, that means I can walk forward after it misses, into range, and then hit my attack and punish the recovery. Now keep in mind that most fighting games actually have hurt boxes that change depending on the attack, which means that I don't actually have to walk forward here. I can actually punish this with like a jab or something. I can actually do this. I didn't have to actually walk forward because when he attacked, his body naturally moved forward to do the attack. But again, this doesn't really matter in Baby Footsies because you only have one attack anyway, and just by definition, this hurt box shifting doesn't actually exist because we're trying to make the game as simple as possible. But anyway, that's strategy 3, which is whiff punishment. And if you think about it, this actually beats both types of poking. So if you recall, strategy 2 was predictive poking. Well, what if he doesn't move forward? Well, what if I just do this attack predictively, but I'm wrong and he doesn't walk into it? Well, then I just whiffed a button and now he can whiff punish by not walking backwards, but by standing still. So you could think of this as a cycle of options where aggressive pokes lose to predictive pokes, which lose to whiff punishing, and then whiff punishing loses to aggressive poking because I walked forward. But that's not really what's going on. What's going on is that there's constant movement by both players, and they both know they want to do attacks, because you can't win the game without attacking. So then the question becomes, when do they attack and when do they keep moving? And so they usually do one of two things. One, they walk forward into their range and then press the button, or two, they wait for you to whiff their attack and maybe walk backwards and then whiff punish it. And so now it's actually starting to make sense as why baby footsies aren't as unuseful as they seem. On the surface, they're like, what's the point of learning baby footsies? Because it's just a theoretical game that doesn't actually exist, and it's actually quite boring. But now that we've gone over the strategies, you're like, wait, these strategies exist in actual fighting games. These strategies exist in games that are far more complex than baby footsies are. These strategies are used today by pro players in all sorts of fighting games. So what's going on here? Why is the game being played the same way even though it's a completely different game? Well, that's because fighting games do have walking and attacking. It's just how the game developers add more and more stuff to that, which makes the game different and more interesting. And so what footsies are, what actual footsies are, what the footsies that players are playing in actual games are, is their interpretation of these add-ons and how that changes baby footsies into something that's actually going on. And so that is the stuff that I want to talk about in future videos, but baby footsies is sort of where I wanted to leave off this first video. So I plan to do 2 more footsies videos. One video talking about common footsies, which are footsies that exist in most fighting games. Most fighting games have dashes, most fighting games have jumps, most fighting games have, at least 2 attacks, not just 1 attack. And then the last video I want to talk about is actual footsies. I want to take a look at some games and actually think about the mechanics that they have that are different and how that changes the way footsies are played. But anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.